He broke the law to save those children. He thought his life was over, that happiness would never find him again. But fate had other plans. Keep watching and don't forget to subscribe. Here, I share powerful true stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary moments. In the summer of 1958, George Clark lived on the edge of Memphis in a small house near an old sawmill. He was a veteran, once a mechanic in the Air Force. Now he repaired trucks for locals, drank cheap coffee, and stayed away from people. Since the war, he had kept everyone at a distance. The only one who stayed with him was his dog, Rusty. Evenings were quiet, filled with the sound of insects and the low fog that came from the swamp. George felt that the world was divided between those who lived and those who only existed. He was among the latter. One hot afternoon, while driving home, he saw a line of old army trucks near a farm not far from the Mississippi border road. There was a group of people standing in the dust, holding bags and small suitcases. Women cried, and children clung to them. Some soldiers in worn uniforms shouted orders and waved papers stamped with official seals. They were taking children away from their families. George stopped his truck and stepped closer. The air was thick with dust and confusion. Someone near him muttered that this was part of a social program, that the government was moving orphans to shelters so they wouldn't become beggars. But George could see clearly that these children were not orphans. Their mothers were right there, trying to hold on to them, being pushed aside. The crowd was silent, afraid to speak or interfere. A boy of about 8 broke free and ran toward a woman in a faded dress, probably his mother. One of the soldiers grabbed him roughly and pulled him back. The woman cried out, but no one helped. George felt something rise in his chest, heavy and hot. The scene was too familiar. He had seen things like this long ago overseas, when people in power decided who deserved to live and who did not. He didn't know what law gave them the right to do this, but he knew it was wrong. Every part of him wanted to turn away, to pretend it wasn't his business. But deep down, he understood that if he did nothing now, he would lose the last piece of himself that still believed in decency. A little to the side, 3 children stood together, an older boy, a girl, and a baby in a woman's arms. They were quiet, their faces pale and tired. When George looked at them, he saw fear mixed with something else, a kind of silent plea. He didn't think, he didn't plan. He just started walking toward them. He didn't yet know that this moment would change everything, his life, his purpose, and the emptiness he had carried for years. When the officer lifted the child like a sack, George could no longer stay still. He stepped forward without thinking. The words came out of his mouth firmly and loudly, as if someone else had spoken them. The crowd turned to look. The air became heavy and silent, broken only by the idle growl of the truck's engine. A few minutes earlier, everything had gone wrong. The woman, the mother of the children, was shouting, trying to explain that they had done nothing wrong. One of the men in uniform pushed her, another raised his weapon, and the gunshot came suddenly. The sound was sharp and final. The bullet hit her in the chest. She fell right in front of her children. They screamed, but the soldiers grabbed them roughly and dragged them toward the truck. George watched as the officer lifted the boy, and something inside him broke. He could not watch any more. The man with the mustache and a yellow armband turned toward him, narrowing his eyes, asking on what grounds he was interfering. George answered without hesitation that he was acting on human grounds. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then the officer gave a short order to take him away. 2 men approached, but George moved first. He grabbed the closest one by the collar, hit him, and turned to strike the second. Shouting filled the air, dust rose, and people ran in all directions. It all happened too fast. The woman had no time to move, and when George saw she was no longer breathing, he understood she was gone. Something inside him snapped. He didn't think. He simply acted. He pulled the children from the soldier's hands and ran. It felt instinctive, like a deep survival reflex. He grabbed the boy and the girl and pushed them into an old Ford parked nearby. The engine hesitated, then finally roared to life. The tires threw sand into the air as the car sped forward. There were no bullets, but the angry shouts followed them down the road. George kept driving, not caring where it led, only that it was away from there, past the fields, past the hills, beyond the county line where authority lost its reach. Inside the car, there was silence. The girl held the baby close, rocking him gently. The older boy sat in the front seat, staring straight ahead, his eyes wet. George didn't speak. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the children's quiet breathing. As the sun began to set, George stopped near an old bridge above a dry riverbed. He got out and looked at the horizon. Beyond the haze, fields stretched far and wide. He didn't know what to do next, only that he couldn't go back. He understood he was now a criminal. The thought didn't frighten him. It felt like the price for something real. Those children were now his responsibility, not because of pity but because he had chosen them. He took a worn army blanket from the trunk, wrapped the youngest, and helped the older boy spread a coat on the ground. When night came, George sat by the dying fire. The children slept beside him. He stared at the embers until his eyes blurred. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Deep inside, something fragile and long forgotten began to move, a quiet belief that life still had meaning. The morning came quietly, as if trying to apologize for yesterday's chaos. Fog lay low over the dry riverbed, hiding the bridge and the tire tracks. George woke up before the children. For a few seconds, he didn't know where he was. Then he saw 3 kids sleeping under his old army coat and remembered everything. He checked the car. Less than half a tank of gas, almost no food, just a bit of bread and a can of peaches. Going back was impossible. The authorities were already searching, and they didn't forgive those who stood against the uniform. But there was one more reason he couldn't leave his dog. The animal had followed him for years. During the escape, George had ordered it to stay behind, hoping to protect it. Now the thought of abandoning his only loyal friend was unbearable. That night after the children fell asleep, he quietly walked back toward town. The air was cold and silent. He stayed low, moving through tall grass until he saw the old house. 2 men in uniform stood by the fence, smoking. Behind the house, tied to a post, sat his dog, silent, alert, waiting. George waited too. When the men turned away, he tossed a small rock toward the barn. The noise made them look the other way. He whistled softly. The dog jerked free and ran straight to him. George caught it, pressed its head to his chest, and they slipped back into the fog. When he returned, the children were still asleep. The dog curled beside them as if it had never left. George sat down, exhausted but calm. Now they could leave, all of them. At dawn, he looked west. Cities to the east meant checkpoints and questions. The west promised quiet roads and open fields. He chose west. When the children woke up, Eli, the oldest, sat up first, ready to protect the others. Julie kept her eyes on the ground. Tommy reached for the sunlight, too young to understand what had changed. George smiled faintly and said they had to keep moving. Then he added softly that they were a family now. They drove for days. Roads got worse, gas harder to find, but the air grew cleaner. George took small jobs in towns, fixing roofs and fences. They slept in barns or in the car. People didn't ask questions. When someone assumed the kids were his, he just nodded. At night, George sat by the fire, the dog lying close. He thought about the line between right and wrong. The law had killed the children's mother. Now he followed something else, simple and real. One morning, a patrol truck blocked the road. Eli whispered, "Dad, don't stop." The word stunned George. "Dad." It hit deep. He pressed the pedal. The officers turned but didn't stop them. By evening, they reached an abandoned farm near the Arkansas border. The roof held, the lock worked, and it became their home. Eli carried wood, Julie baked bread, Tommy chased chickens, and the dog watched over them. At night, George looked at the stars and thought of the woman he couldn't save. He didn't know her name, but her children and the dog were his reason to go on. He whispered, "I won't let them take you." And for the first time, it wasn't fear, it was love. Autumn came quietly, as if the world had changed overnight. The leaves turned yellow, the air became cold and sharp, and the sky looked wide and empty. Life on the farm settled into a calm routine. The children woke up early, fed the chickens, carried water, and played near the well. Julie learned to cook, Eli worked on fixing the barn roof, and little Tommy ran barefoot through the grass until the sun went down. George sometimes stopped by the window to watch them. It gave him a strange, fragile feeling of peace, but deep inside, he never fully relaxed. Something in him stayed tense, a quiet warning that the past was still out there. He knew it was only a matter of time before it came back. He avoided the nearest town and only went there when he had to. At the gas station, he stayed quiet and kept to himself. Every glance felt like a question, every word like a risk. Then one day, he saw a dark Dodge with government plates parked near the station. Two men stood beside it, both in uniform, talking in short, firm sentences. George knew right away they weren't locals. Their eyes didn't look around, they searched. He paid for the gas and walked out calmly, but he could feel their eyes following him. One of the men watched too long. George felt the weight of that stare pressing on his back. He got in the car and drove off slowly, acting normal, but inside he knew the truth, they were close. That night the house was quiet. The children were drawing by the table, Tommy already asleep under a blanket. George sat by the window, listening to the creak of wood and the sound of the wind. He checked their supplies, looked over the barn, and found an old path leading to the river. A plan formed in his mind. 3 days later the path arrived. Dust rose on the road before they heard the engine. A black pickup stopped by the gate. Two men got out, a sheriff and a younger officer. George stood on the porch, the wind moving his shirt, the children breathing quietly inside. The men walked toward him slowly, confident and calm. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. George couldn't hear their words, but he understood what they meant: an order, an accusation, an ending. When one of them raised his hand, George already knew what was coming. The gunshot split the air. The children screamed, dishes broke, and the sound of chaos filled the small house. George moved fast, pulling the children down and shielding them with his body. They escaped through a gap in the back wall and ran toward the river path. Eli carried Tommy, Julie followed, and George stayed behind them looking back. Bullets hit the trees, sending leaves flying. At the river they found an old wooden boat. George pushed it into the water, helped the children climb in, and shoved off with a long stick. The water was cold but safe. It carried them away from the noise, from the smoke, from everything. When the boat reached the opposite shore, George sat down, shaking. The children were wet and scared but alive. That was all that mattered. He lifted Tommy into his arms and started walking along the shore. The moon reflected on the water, the wind moved through the trees. Somewhere ahead, beyond the woods, there had to be a place where they could rest, maybe even begin again. For the first time in a long while, George didn't look back. The north greeted them with cold, but the cold was honest. It did not hide behind fake smiles or false promises. Tom rented an old house at the bottom of a hill where fog hung low in the mornings. For the first time in a long while, the children laughed without fear. Their laughter came simply because life was starting to feel real again. The oldest boy helped Tom chop wood and learned how to keep the fire burning. The middle girl carried water from the pump and practiced writing the letters Tom drew for her with charcoal. The youngest ran around the house, holding an old doll she had found in the attic. None of them thought about the word run. They only knew that this man was their safety and that no one would hurt them again. Tom got a job as a mechanic at a workshop on the edge of town. He worked quietly, 12 hours a day. His boss was an older man with a gray mustache who didn't ask many questions. The town minded its own business. People sometimes noticed the 3 dark-skinned children living on the hill, but they didn't say anything. They assumed Tom was simply helping someone who needed it. Winter brought heavy snow and long nights. One evening on his way home, Tom's truck got stuck on a narrow road. From a nearby house, a woman came out. She was tall, wearing a long coat, her voice calm and quiet. She offered help. That was how Tom met Rachel, a young, beautiful widow and a millionaire. Her husband had been a wealthy businessman who died suddenly 2 years earlier, leaving her an enormous fortune, land, houses, and investments that she barely cared to touch. Rachel was rich beyond measure, but she lived simply, alone in a large house with two loyal dogs and a loneliness that even money could not silence. She didn't question Tom. She just gave him a blanket, hot tea, and a place to warm up by the fire. Her manner was calm and graceful, her kindness steady and effortless. Tom noticed that despite the luxury around her, the polished floors, the soft carpets, the golden frames on the walls, she seemed more human than anyone he had met in years. That moment started something new in his life. At first, it was just kindness and small visits. Later, it grew into trust and quiet affection. Rachel saw a man who carried pain but not bitterness. Tom saw a woman who knew how to stay silent beside him, without demands or fear. The children accepted her quickly. The girl began helping Rachel in the garden. The oldest boy went fishing with Rachel's brother when he came to visit. The youngest fell asleep in Rachel's arms as if she had always belonged there. Time passed. The house on the hill became warm and full of light. There was the smell of bread and the sound of laughter. Tom no longer looked over his shoulder. No letters from the past came, no one followed them. He understood that some things could never be erased, but new ones could be built if he kept moving forward. One spring morning, he went outside and saw Rachel planting a young tree near the gate. The children were standing beside her with small shovels, smiling. Tom came closer to help her with the roots. The soil felt warm and alive under his hands. When he looked up, he realized this was home, not the one he had escaped from, not one built out of fear, but one grown from loyalty and care. The man who once ran from his past had become a father to 3 children and a husband to a woman who had everything the world could offer: wealth, beauty, and grace, yet chose to measure her fortune not by possessions, but by the peace and laughter they now shared. And when the wind moved the curtains that spring, Tom smiled, not out of habit, but because he was truly free. Summer in Pennsylvania was warm and long. The air felt heavy, like honey, and reminded Tom of the South they had escaped. But now the heat did not bring fear. It was only a season, part of a life he had finally allowed himself to live. The house on the hill had changed. The roof was fixed, the fence painted. There were garden beds, a swing, and a dog that watched over everyone with calm loyalty. Tom had learned to laugh when the oldest boy dropped a bucket of water. He no longer flinched when someone knocked on the door. He stopped hiding the children's faces and no longer whispered for them to be quiet. The world had grown wider and fear had faded away. Rachel was always near. Her kindness never asked for anything. Sometimes she simply sat beside him on the porch while the sun went down behind the river. Their silence became a language of its own, not the kind that hides pain, but the kind that keeps peace. In the fall, Tom took the children to school for the first time. The teachers looked uncertain, but Rachel spoke to them calmly and the tension disappeared. The oldest brought home his first drawing. The girl learned a song. The little one started to speak in full sentences. Each day something new appeared in their home, small, simple, and real. One evening Tom found an old newspaper in a drawer. It was the one that told about that night in the South. The headline was faded, but the memories came back sharply. He sat for a long time, staring at the words as if at an old scar. Then he stood, walked to the stove, and threw the paper into the fire. It burned quickly and quietly, leaving nothing behind. He looked at the children sleeping in their room, at Rachel reading by the fire, and understood that he owed nothing to the past anymore. Everything that had been lost now had a new form, not perfect, but living and real, built with effort and love. That winter they had guests, neighbors, friends, people from church. Tom sat at the long table watching the faces around him. The children laughed loudly. Rachel smiled beside him. And for the first time he felt certain that the miracle had already happened. Not the night he saved the children, but now, when they were all here, safe and together. Later he went outside. The air was cold and sharp. He looked at the sky, no signs, no promises, just a quiet, clear feeling inside. Everything had come true, not because life was fair, but because he had not given up when it was cruel. In the morning, they would drive to town to buy Christmas gifts and argue over who would decorate the tree. Maybe someone passing by would see them and think they were just a happy family. They would be right, though not completely, because behind that happiness was a story of pain, courage, and love that had grown from darkness. And when Tom looked at the three children, now truly his, he knew it had all been worth it. There was a reward greater than forgiveness, the chance to begin again. And he did. I hope this story moved you as much as it did me. Tell me what you felt, the moments that hit hardest, the ones that made you think or maybe even smile. Your thoughts keep this channel alive. And don't go far. Tomorrow, another powerful story awaits, one you definitely don't want to miss.